Special coffee with Dragan emergency session. Emergency cup of coffee. Brothers and sisters, bros, my LGBTQ family. Telemites. Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. Rainbow people, whoever listens to this. This is an emergency coffee with Dragan on. The discussion is what I call the Christmas crash. It's a scenario that have developed with the recent ongoing because of the trade war, and it has to do with the stock market. So what I'm calling the Christmas crash is the possibility of a crash before Christmas. Now the markets close, of course, on Christmas on the 24th, North American markets at least, and some Asian markets, of course. But we have seen a downturn. Even now, as I'm speaking, the markets are open in Asia, Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, the main stock exchanges of the Asian markets. Selling, of course, securities, dealing forex, and although that's more 24/7, we're not going to that right now, but nonetheless, markets are open in Asia. It's about 8:35 EST, Eastern Standard Time, here in Hawk Island, Montreal, baby. So this is Coffee with Dragan, the Christmas crash. I'm not saying 100%. I'm saying it's a possibility that it will occur because the stock market has had a prolonged downturn. Significant downturn in accumulated percentage, several percentage points in the past months. Now, several factors are at play. First, have a cup of coffee, say a blessing, get yourself a cup of coffee, meditate upon the words. If you have something to add, please do so. Comment, to suggest a link, statistics, correlations, finance, economics, anything of value that can add, contribute, and of course, find perhaps solutions in the possibility and what can we do next. Myself today, for example, have been on a long cardio walk for my cardio, for my health, about 4.5 hours walk. Tried doing some radio, volunteering for some radio, and had an event for other volunteering in the afternoon. So I've done kind of like 3 sets of walking, accumulated 4.5 hours of cardio walking. So we need to stay healthy again. Come work out with me at the World Citizens Gym. Besides having a loving coffee and discussing and philosophizing and being a universal spiritual teacher, a LGBTQ world citizen and multidisciplinary artist, more also an independent fitness instructor. Together, that's the philosophy, that's the value, that's the principle. Together, peace, love, and harmony, and deeply committed to the principle of non-violence, committed to the principle of non-violence, committed to it. Of course, with the only exception being in self-defense, Back to the topic at hand, ladies and gentlemen, calling again for world peace, security, and prosperity, again committed to non-violence. But the topic is a serious one, and it is the stock market downturn and how it affects the whole economy. The economy, of course, job creation, foreign investment, direct investment, consumer confidence, creation of new capital for entrepreneurship, and thus jobs, and of course also the wages increases. There's a correlation there. The wages, to increase the wages for the majority of the worker, which have stagnated, and we see the prices of food increasing in Montreal. I've seen it myself. First, I have to note that at the present moment in time, I'm financially struggling. Just checked my bank account and cringed, was minus $500. And of course, have pay a monthly fee to have what's called the overdraft protection, so I'm not over penalized in fees. $42, and a lot of people do pay that fee. I advise you to take perhaps the $4 a month rather than pay it twice. You save at least 50%, if not more. Overdraft is relatively good insurance, overdraft protection. I'm in debt about $11,000. Unfortunately, pay about $80 interest per month. And in the month of December, for example, have only had $698 from the government of Canada, what's called social assistance, welfare, or so, aka welfare. And the only work that I'm doing on a regular basis, weekly basis, is volunteering work. It's not compensated financially, but have a social compensation and social value to it. Even though I'm doing as a volunteer work and have been doing volunteer work for years, I'm committed to volunteering, volunteering a lot in my philosophy, in my values to volunteering, of course, and have been for years in different organizations, different communities, and different parts. So that being stated, ladies and gentlemen, $698 I've received December 1st, paid rent, fixed expense, paid electricity bill, paid a phone bill, of course, left about 156 for food. You understand the struggle. Of course, I'm servicing interest, about $80 a month, which is, of course, was happy that the Bank of Canada did not move the interest rates. So of course, if they move the interest rates up, the ones who have mortgages, credit cards, and debts, our interest servicing increases, thus less money for us, the people. That being stated, my own financial struggle at the present moment in time, December 20th, don't understand solidarity with people struggle world, occurs across the world. Artists, of course, myself an artist, got, this is before I go on, got 7 billion free hugs to give to each and every human being on the planet. I'm gonna repeat what I said: financially precarious, banks, money, have more than 7 billion free hugs to give for each and every human being on the planet. Have 7 billion, more than 7 billion free hugs to give for each and every human being on the planet. So when you see me, you want that free hug, come and get it, brother, sister. Come and get it. Stock market decline, stock market downturn, stock market in the red. What's happening? A lot of things are happening. The pressures are, of course, from the initiation of the trade war by the imposition of tariffs by Trump on China. Now, this is what you have to think, to meditate. This is very, very, very important, because the world economy, the integrated world economy, to the World Trade Organization, to the financial arrangements, to everything, is very, very integrated, right? And it has been more and more going towards integration since 1984. Majority of it's free, but also fair trade and for it. But a lot of it is just free, but not necessarily fair. So there's a lot of reform, and a lot of reform to be done, especially in the corporate and the financial sectors. Now, this is the important, the core, the essence, the fundamentals of all the mechanisms of the stock market, of world trade and international finance. China is the biggest today, now as I'm speaking, and has been for a few years, is the biggest producer and exporter of goods, right? By extension, China, number one in production and exporting and export, right? And by extension, seller, the biggest seller in the economy, world economy, right? So you got the biggest seller with the biggest market today, the biggest buyer, the biggest importer, and the biggest consumer. You got these two giants, right, who since 1984 align more or less with the world economy and other geopolitical events and the integration of the world economy through free trade agreements and world trade organizations and corporations, and the biggies, you know, the Walmarts of the world, the Apples of the world, the Huawei's of the world, you know, and other the course, ESO of the world, the black rocks of the world, rocks, like a rock black. Not a lot of people know about it. If you're not in finance, I'm studying, you might have not heard the term. We'll not go into that specific finance organization right now. But suffice it to say that this has happened, is the reality today, and it has been for a few years. United States, the biggest buyer; China, the biggest seller; China, the biggest producer; United States, the biggest consumer; China, the biggest exporter; United States, the biggest importer. And of course, those three factors are kind of interrelated. You can see buyer, seller, buying, selling. The biggest buyer, the biggest seller, the biggest exporter, the biggest importer. Of course, not necessarily from each other as a whole, though that's a big proportion. But with other nation states, as Canada, myself, a world Canadian LGBTQ citizen, and other world states. But they are the biggest exporter, biggest producer. China, United States is the biggest consumer, importer, and buyer. The biggest seller and producer by extension of goods, and the biggest buyer. Not necessarily in correlation with one to the other, but with the world economy, right? With the world. Listen, and this is, you have to meditate. And these two, right, have been this world trade synchronicity, and that relationship like that over the past years of the biggest producer, exporter, and seller, and the biggest buyer, consumer, and importer, right? With other countries such as Japan, the EU, Germany, all the World Trade Organization members, and X and Y and Z, and 156 other nations surrounding the China-US. India, of course, economic powerhouses of export and import, production, consumption, buying and selling. Because finance fundamentally, as complex as finance, all equations, I'm going to get a headache, and so complex and virtuous, and percentages and points and fractions and x's and y's and z, and it's so complex. But fundamentally, the core, the essence, and the fundamentals, and the principle, if you want, the finance, is very simple. It's about buying and selling goods, services, you name it. It's about buying and selling, the core, the essence, and the fundamental of finance. As much as we have thick books in finance, and there's details and complexity of the world, it's a universe of finance. To gather wisdom, understanding, and knowledge of finance, the whole universe, right? But when you take all that apart, you get to the core, to the essence, to the fundamentals, it's like mind, heart, mind. Buying, selling, and vice versa. Selling, buying. It's about buying and selling. It's complex, and hundreds of institutions and laws and regulations, and international and local and national and municipal and financial statements, complex. Fundamentally, it's about buying and selling. The core of finance, the essence of finance, is about buying and selling goods and services. So, the Christmas crash. I've dubbed it the Christmas crash. It's almost time for Christmas time. For the 20th, on the 24th, tomorrow. I'm calling it a Christmas because it could be not necessarily on Christmas Day. The markets, North American markets, Christmas Day, they're closed, right? It's holiday, the markets are not open. But fundamentally, it could happen, right? It could happen tomorrow. It's still a trading day tomorrow, Friday, right? And it can happen after that. It can be in a few weeks, just a few days tomorrow, or in between, right? The Christmas crash. And the markets have been down considerably. Now, as I said, and this is my correlation to the fundamentals, things that work here. The tariffs imposed by Trump on China, as I said, China the biggest exporter, producer, and seller of goods, SSB buyer, etc. More than $200 billion on is about 10% on about $260 billion up to date, and it's supposed to be a third imposed once, twice, in different after 3 months. Another set. It's about I think it's around 300 million worth of goods at this point in time. Right? A million, not even million, million, billion. 1 billion is 1,000 million. Just let that sink in. So 1 billion is 1,000 million. 1 billion has 9 zeros, right? So he imposed tariffs on so much amount, on accumulated around 200, almost $300 billion. Not that entire amount, but about 10-11%. So let's say around $30 billion in just tax on tariffs, right? With the exemption of some goods. This is huge for at the macro level. So that's why prices there's supposed to be pressure to prices to go up, right? Because of that, right? Otherwise, it's that type of economic relationship. There's pressure for the prices to increase. Right? Now, that pressure is exerted by also a problem in China, which is the growing debt, of course, of China. You see, China, we don't know much about their finance. We know a little bit. We know we can learn. There's Bank of China. There's major banking institutions in China. But fundamentally, there's not private banking as we have in the West in China, right? It's very different. The banking in China is socialist in nature. It's based on communist principles. Still, it's government owned. It's different, right? It's that distinction. But nonetheless, it has two systems. One country, two systems, what they call it. It has maintain harmony. Harmony. And growing debt in the past decade. A lot of people have borrowed money to invest in the stock market. Right? I've said this before a couple of months ago. And these were not necessarily savvy investors. These were more adventurous people who made a good living, made a good life, and they put whatever down for the bank to give them loans, and they went in the stock market. But it was more, I would say, gambling than actually investing, knowing exactly what you're doing and the fundamentals of the stock market and markets and production and consumption and the companies, the statements, the fundamentals of stocks exchange, of securities exchange, because you're dealing in a portion of the company. Basically, a security is a portion of percentage, could be 0.0001223%, but it's still that, right, at the end of the day. Right, because the total amount of shares of the company is basically the 100%, the totality, the ownership of the company, the corporation, who are on the stock market, right, after their IPO, initial public offering. We'll not go into that. That's more studious, more exactly, but general. Right, so these general factors, debt in China, and corporate also debt, that is business debt, because they're corporate. They call it, most economists, financial analysts, and news in the news is corporate Chinese debt, but it's more cooperatives in China based than corporations. Although there is corporations, and of course there's people who are very wealthy in China, of course, are billionaires. China has billionaires. Yes, China does have billionaires indeed. And these factors, right? So these pressures now, because are more intensified because of the tariffs, of the trade war tariffs on the stock market. So there's people panicking, right, and seeing on the long run, so not investing in the market, right? The value has gone down, right? People have also another fear, speculation, that a lot of stocks are overvalued, right? That the boom has reached peak levels. Some even make the comparison with 1929, how it was the highest, and then Black Monday, Black Tuesday, and Black Thursday, or Black Wednesday and Black Tuesday, Black Wednesday, Black Friday, Black, because there's Monday it rebounded a bit or something like that on October 29th, right? If you study finance, 1929 October, end of October. So it was Black Friday, Black Tuesday, three blacks, black, 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 Black Friday, Black Tuesday, and Black Wednesday. Was 37% was wiped out value of the stock market in less than a week. Imagine 37%. So what's happening now? Small percentage. Yesterday it fell 1.6%. The Nikkei. The other day it fell again 1 point something percent. The other day it rebounded, but only minimum 0 point something percent. So in this past month, it's more than 7 or more than 6, about 6% that I lost, right? So it can be that in a whole day you see minus. Tomorrow, if we see minus in the thousands, could we say this? It's approaching a crash? Yes and no. Some would argue it's a correction. Could be a correction. I'm not making a complete Christmas crash. I'm not making a complete prediction. Christmas crash is gonna happen. I don't want it to happen because it's gonna create problems and jobs and this. And worst case scenario, a stock market crash will trigger a global financial panic, and that could spawn a world economic collapse. It's Great Depression again, super depression, right? So a stock market crash could cause a global financial panic, which could spawn a world economic collapse, and it could happen in an aggregate time of by, let's say, February 11th. Say, right? Could be crash, Christmas crash. You see a few thousand points, Dow Jones, right? New York Stock Exchange, Nikkei in Asia. We can see tomorrow. I'm not surprised. I'm not gonna be surprised if tomorrow I'm doing actually Santa Claus tomorrow for kids. So it's gonna be therapy. I'm gonna give them some gifts, and it's not a big gig. It's only $50, but it's gonna help me to get through the holidays, to get some food, some candy, some chocolate. Santa's. So anyhow, I'm Santa tomorrow for children, which is cool. Bring them some joy. So after I'm Santa, back to reality. Home, 3 o'clock. Stock market down severely. Could be in the red. Is it gonna be scarlet? Could be. Not predicting 100%. I'm just saying it's a high probability, high possibility of what I call a Christmas crash, stock market crash. I'm talking not just North America, Montreal Stock Exchange or Toronto Stock Exchange or New York Stock Exchange. And the New York Stock Exchange, by the way, is the biggest stock market change in terms of capital market valuation, meaning by what's called capital, the amount of money that's supposedly the value of all the stocks traded on the New York Stock Exchange, right? It's in the trillions of dollars. You can imagine it's in the $23 trillion, right? It's more than billions, right? So what's going on? How come? First, and there's several other small correlations. First is the initiation of the trade war by Trump by imposing tariffs on China, who's the biggest exporter of goods, the biggest producer of goods, and of course the biggest seller, right, by the United States. And debt, over indebtedness. Even the United States of America, there's a lot of debt. I've read in an article a few months ago that more than half of Americans couldn't come up with $500 in an emergency because of being so much in debt. More than half. That's quite concerning, because $500, you'd say, well, $500, you know, $400 it was the amount, I think. $400. More than half of Americans in a crisis or in an emergency cannot come up with $400, right? So That's one. One factor, and this to me is one of the main factors. This the imposition by Trump of tariffs, and not only, of course, imposed tariffs on China, but on Canadian aluminum and steel as well. So this triggered, of course, a response from China, who also imposed tariffs and duties on goods from the United States. So they retaliated, right? They retaliated. They didn't take it, and now we have the debt. Of course, Canadians, also the debt per household of Canadians is reached. The ratio per debt per household income reached more than 168%. So meaning that there's more debt than income, right? Household income. And there's averages and all on that, but nonetheless, since 1984, it showed clearly that it's kept on going up. And of course, if Bank of Canada raises the interest rates go higher, and depending on the interest you pay. If you pay 19%, 25, more than 11% is awful. I always say 3% is acceptable. 3% is acceptable. Okay, so that's one point. What else? The Huawei affair. What's this all about? Quite something. Huawei, Chinese telecommunication company. December 1st, Canadian authorities, the RCMP, the Mounties, called the Mounties because they're horsey, they go on horses. They're not that much on horses anymore now. They're not cars, but some of them still are horsed up. Mounties is like our federal police. Arrested in Vancouver because we have, of course, Canadians have an extradition treaty with the United States, so legally we had an obligation to arrest her. From my understanding, if that's correct, I haven't read the extradition treaty and under what circumstances, but there was an arrest warrant issued for her, if my understanding is correct, in New York, state of New York, or something like that, under allegedly having run a company called Skycom or something. Skycom, yeah, Skycom is the name. That did business with Iran, contravening or conflicting with the sanctions imposed upon Iran, the Iranian regime. Right? So we're learning more about this. They deny it. Skycom has nothing to do with Huawei. So they're denying this. The other more sketchy thing is the spying allegation of Huawei. I've discussed technically with somebody in Montreal and Hawk Island. He's of the opinion that it's feasible, very feasible, what they're discussing in terms of tech wise. That fundamentally it is possible to do that. Huawei is a huge. It has overtaken Apple last year to become the second producer and, by extension, seller of smartphones, mostly in Asia. Is the biggest, from my understanding, world's telecommunication equipment maker, including internet infrastructure or cables, you name it, X and Y and Z, all the products. Do not know all the products that Huawei produces. Do not know all of them, but telecommunication infrastructure, and a major player in the up and coming, exciting, high-speed new tech 5G, basically fifth generation telecommunication with smartphones, satellite, not satellite, but the cell phone technology, right? Which has to do, of course, with waves and radio and transmission and reception, and no just theory about the technicality of it in theory, but not, of course, I'm not telecommunications scholar or can learn more. No theoretically and in theory know about it, and can always am open to learning more. China now has detained a third Canadian up to date, now the 20th of December. She was released, Meng Huazhou, a few days ago on bail, $10 million bail, huge bail, with some conditions of security, to be under surveillance, ankle brands, bracelet, and what have you. So this also has put negative pressures on stock market somehow. It's not really a paradox, considering Huawei is a big player, right, influencing and doing business with other companies and what have you. And of course the uncertainty created by this fact, right? So there's an aggregate of correlates that could cause the Christmas crash.